He knew. That is what my mother said to me. She was 88 years old, and she was sitting in a vinyl chair by the window, and she folded her hands in her lap the way she had folded them my whole life, and she said it again, quieter. Your father knew, Diane. He knew before he ever married me. I was 61 years old. I had driven an hour and 10 minutes up the coast to ask my mother one single question, and she had just answered it. And the answer had taken the man I had called Dad for 61 years, and the man who was actually my father, and made them, in one sentence, two different people. I am going to tell you everything my mother said in that little room. I am. But if I begin there, you will not understand what it cost or what it gave back to me, because that one sentence only means what it means when you set it against the 61 years that came before it, and against the man I had spent most of those years, quietly, carefully, and very wrongly resenting. My name is Diane. For 34 years, I worked as a labor and delivery nurse in a county hospital on the coast of North Carolina, which means I have spent the better part of my life in the exact room where families are made. I have placed more babies into more shaking arms than I could ever count. I have watched 1,000 ordinary men become fathers in the space of one long afternoon. And I am telling you that right at the start so that you can feel the shape of what I am about to admit to you. Because I, of all people on this earth, should have known what a father was, and I spent 61 years looking straight at one of the finest I will ever meet and calling him something less. Let me give you my father first, the one who raised me. His name was Ray, and he was a carpenter, and I do not mean a man who hung doors, although of course he could. I mean a man who built staircases that curved and cabinets that closed with a sound like a held breath, and who could look at a length of cedar the way other men looked at the racing page. He had a shop out behind our house, and my whole childhood smelled of two things, sawdust and coffee, and to this day I cannot walk past either one of them without my chest going tight. Ray was a quiet man. I want to be fair about that word, because quiet is going to do a great deal of work in this story, and I do not want you to hear it wrong. He was not sullen. He was not cold the way a slammed door is cold. He was simply a man who had decided, somewhere long before I ever knew him, that words were a tool you used carefully and sparingly, the way you used a good sharp chisel, and not a thing you let run loose around the house. I was the firstborn. My brother Gary came along 4 years behind me, and here's the thing that shaped the whole of my childhood, the thing I built my entire understanding of myself upon. My father was easy with Gary, and he was careful with me. I need you to feel the difference, because it is a small difference, and small is exactly what made it so impossible to ever point at. With Gary, my father was loose. He would rough up the boy's hair just walking past him. He would let Gary out into the shop, and the two of them would lose a whole Saturday together out there, and I would hear them through the kitchen window, my father actually laughing, a sound that came out of him about as often as snow came to that coast. He taught Gary to fish, and to drive, and to swear a little, and he did all of it with his shoulders down, easy, a man entirely at home in his own life. With me, my father was kind. He was never once unkind, and I want that on the record and underlined. But he was kind the way a good man is kind to someone else's child. There was a held quality to it, a carefulness. He would help me with my arithmetic at the kitchen table, and his voice would be patient and even and just slightly formal, and when we were finished he would say, "Good, Diane," and pat the table twice and stand up. He patted the table. He did not pat me. As a girl, I noticed that. Children always notice the table. I will give you one memory, because one good memory will do the work of 10. When I was 17, I got my acceptance into the nursing program at the college up in Greenville. I had wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything in my life, and I came running into the house with the letter, and I found my father in the kitchen, and I held it out to him. And he read it, the whole way down, taking his time the way he took his time with everything. And then he handed it back to me and he said, "That is a fine thing, Diane. You will be good at that." And he meant it. I knew even then that he meant it. And then he went back out to the shop. 2 years later, my brother Gary, who was a decent boy and not a scholar, made the junior varsity baseball team. second string. He would barely play an inning all season, and my father took the whole afternoon off work for it. He stood at the fence. I watched him do it. I watched my father stand at a chain-link fence with his hands in his pockets and his face lit up like a window at Christmas, over a boy who would spend that whole season on a bench. And I was 19 years old, and I understood, in the way you understand a thing in your stomach before your head is caught up, that whatever it was my father had, the thing he handed Gary for free, I was simply never going to get it. Not because I had not earned it. I had a letter in my hand that said I had earned it. I was not going to get it because I was me. So I built a theory. I was a young woman, and I was hurt, and I did what hurt young people do, which is take a wound and turn it into an explanation. My theory was that my father had wanted a different kind of daughter, or had quietly wanted another son, or simply did not have whatever the particular thing was inside him that would have let him love me the easy way. And once I had the theory, I stopped testing it. You always do. A theory like that is a kind of shelter, even when it is a cold one, and I moved into it, and I lived there for 40 years. What I did with that theory was this. I got polite. As I grew up, I became, toward my own father, unfailingly, beautifully polite. I called on Sundays. I asked the right questions. I sent the cards and I drove home for the holidays, and the entire time, I held him at exactly arm's length, and I told myself that I was being mature about it. I told myself I was simply meeting the man where he was. I had a whole speech ready for myself about respecting who a person is and not needing more from them than they have to give. I was very wise about it. And underneath all of the wisdom, every single day of it, there was a girl standing at a chain-link fence, wondering what was wrong with her. My mother, Joan, was the warmth in that house. Where my father was sparing, my mother was generous, out loud, with everything she had. And she adored me. I want to say that part plainly because it matters later on. My mother adored me in a way that was almost fierce, that could feel, when I was small, like a great deal of weather for one little girl. She praised me to the neighbors. She kept every report card I ever brought home. She would take my face in her two hands and look at me as though she were checking that I was still there. And here is what my theory did with my mother's love. Because a theory will eat anything you feed it. I decided my mother loved me double because she was making up for him. That her warmth was a standing apology for the held, careful thing my father could not get past. I had my whole family worked out by the time I was 25, and I was wrong about every piece of it, and would not learn how wrong for another 36 years. I am going to tell you about the DNA test now, and about the little room at Pelican Point. But I want you to hold on to my mother's hands on my face. Hold on to my father standing at that fence, because I am about to hand you the single fact that turns both of those pictures inside out, and I want you to feel them turn. My father got sick when he was 79. It was the slow kind, the kind that takes a year and gives you time for everything except the things that actually matter. I was a nurse. I had sat at a great many bedsides. I knew, better than my brother did, better than my mother did, exactly what each stage was and roughly how long it would last. And I want to tell you what I did with all that hard-won professional knowledge. I used it to keep my distance. I drove home, and I sat by his bed, and I was, once again, unfailingly competent. I adjusted his pillows correctly. I knew what to ask the hospice nurse. I was useful. And I never once, in that whole last year, climbed up over the wall I had spent 40 years building, and held my father's hand, and told him I loved him, and asked him the things a daughter is supposed to ask before the asking runs out. I told myself there would be a better moment. I told myself he would not want the fuss. And the truth I can finally say out loud is that I was 60 years old, and still that girl at the fence, still certain that if I reached for him, I would feel him go careful in my hands, and I could not bear to feel it one more time. So, I did not reach. He died in the spring, and at his funeral I stood up and I gave the eulogy, and I want to tell you exactly how long my eulogy was. It was 4 sentences. I said that my father had been a good provider. I said that he had been a skilled craftsman and a hard worker. I said that he had loved his family in his own way. I said that he would be missed. And then I sat back down and I watched my brother Gary stand up and weep so hard that he could barely get through his, and I felt, at my own father's funeral, like a guest. A polite, well-dressed guest who had known the deceased somewhat. I gave my father 4 sentences, and I have spent the 3 years since then standing back up at that podium in my mind, in the middle of the night, trying to give him the rest of them. And by the time I am finished telling you this, you are going to understand why I cannot. You will understand what those 4 thin sentences really were. They were not the truth about my father at all. They were the truth about how badly I had been lied to, and how completely, and for how long I had believed it. It was my daughter who started it, and she started it as a joke, the way the worst earthquakes start as nothing at all. Her name is Megan, she is 34, and the Christmas after my father had been gone 2 years, she gave the whole family those ancestry kits. The little boxes. The tube you spit into. One for everybody, all of us gathered around my mother's kitchen table on Christmas afternoon, filling up these little tubes, laughing. My mother saying she did not see why anyone needed a machine to tell her she was Scotch-Irish and Baptist. I want you to see that kitchen. I want you to see my mother, 86 years old that Christmas, laughing with a little plastic tube held up in her hand, because that was the last completely ordinary afternoon my family ever had, and not one of us knew it. And I have come to think there is something important in the fact that the truth, when it finally came for us, came dressed up as a stocking present. We mailed the tubes off. We forgot about them, the way you do. And it was the very end of February when the email came through to say that the results were ready. I opened mine on a Tuesday evening at my own kitchen table with a cup of tea, expecting nothing. There were the percentages, the little colored map. Scotland and Ireland and a slice of England, more or less what my mother had promised us. And then below that, a list. The site does this. It shows you the other people who have taken the same test and shared DNA with you, your relatives, and puts them in order of how close they are, with a little label beside each name telling you what that person is to you. Gary had taken his test, so Gary was on my list, right up near the top, where a brother belongs. And next to my brother's name, the little label did not say brother. It did not say full sibling. It said half sibling. I had been a nurse for 34 years, so my very first response was not grief. It was profession. I thought, the test is wrong. These things are statistics, not scripture. Labs swap samples. It happens. I have personally seen stranger laboratory errors than this one. And I actually felt a kind of relief, telling myself that. And then, because I am thorough, because 34 years of charting at 3 in the morning makes a person thorough, I kept reading. I made myself keep reading down the list. My father's people were a large family, and several of them, his cousins, his folks up in the Piedmont, had taken this very same test, because that side of the family had a genealogy enthusiast or 2 in it. They were all over Gary's list of matches. Gary matched them the easy way that you match cousins. And I went down my own list, looking for those very same names, the people who should have been my cousins too, and they were not there. Not one of them. I did not match a single living person from my father's family. What I did match, in a tight little cluster near the top, sitting right there under that word half-sibling, were strangers. 4 or 5 of them. Names I had never once heard in my life, and every one of them carried a surname I had never heard either. And they were close. The cold arithmetic of them was close. I sat at my kitchen table and did the arithmetic I had done, gently, for 1,000 other frightened people across my career. The genetics talk. The who got what from whom. My mother and I have the same face. My mother carried me and bore me. There was no question anywhere about my mother. So if Gary and I were only half, if my brother and I shared 1 parent and not 2, then the parent we did not share was the other one. The parent Gary and I did not share was the father. Gary was Ray's son, and I was not Ray's daughter. The test did not have an opinion about that. The test was not being cruel to me, and it was not being kind. The test simply knew, the way a number knows, and it had been sitting quietly in my email inbox since February, just waiting for me to be thorough enough to come and find out. I did not cry that first night. I think I was too far down underneath it to cry. I sat in my kitchen until my tea went stone cold, and I understood, slowly, the way the tide comes up over your feet before you decide to notice it, that there was now exactly one person left alive who could tell me how this had happened. And she was 88 years old, in a vinyl chair by a window, in a place called Pelican Point, an hour and 10 minutes up the coast. I did not call ahead. I was afraid that if I gave her warning, I would be giving her time to build something, and I did not want to drive an hour and 10 minutes toward a story. I wanted my mother's actual, undefended face when I asked her. She was glad to see me, the way she is always glad to see me, and then she looked at me a second time, the way mothers do, and the gladness shifted into something braced. She has known me for 61 years. She knew I had not driven all the way up there on an ordinary Tuesday for nothing. I sat down on the edge of her bed, across from her chair, and I did not have a gentle way into it, so I simply laid it down. I told her about Megan's Christmas kits. I told her what the website had said about Gary and me. I told her I did not match one soul on Dad's side of the family. And then I asked her, and my voice was steadier than I had any right to expect, "Mama, was Dad my father?" And my mother looked out the window for a long while, and then she said the thing that I told you at the very start of this. She said, "He knew." She said, "Your father knew, Diane. He knew before he ever married me." And then, with her hands folded quietly in her lap, my mother told me the story she had been carrying entirely alone for 61 years. And I am going to tell it to you the way that she told it to me, because she had clearly told it to herself, in silence, 10,000 times, and it came out of her now almost smooth. In the spring of 1963, my mother was 19 years old, and she fell in love with a young man named Russell. He was 20, he worked down at the lumber yard, and by every account my mother ever gave me, he was charming and quick, and not, in the end, a steady sort of person. They were together the better part of a year, and then a job came up. A good one, a real one, building something out in Texas, and Russell took it, and he told my mother that he would send for her just as soon as he was settled. He did not send for her. And I want to be careful here, because it would be the easiest thing to make Russell the villain of this, and my mother would not allow it, not even now. She said he was young and frightened, that the distance did its quiet work the way distance does, and his letters got shorter and then stopped. She never believed he was wicked. She believed he was a young man who found that the brave thing was further away than he had thought, and so did the other thing instead. I have decided to believe her. It cost me nothing, and she knew the man and I never did. By the time my mother understood that nobody was coming to send for her, she also understood that she was pregnant. With me. It was 1964, and she was 20 years old and unmarried in a small Baptist town on the North Carolina coast, and I do not think a person my own daughter's age can fully feel the weight of what those plain facts meant back then. It was not an embarrassment. It was a catastrophe. It was the kind of thing that could close a family's front door against you for good. And there was a young man in that town named Ray. He was 24, he was already a carpenter, already quiet, and he had been, my mother said, half in love with her for 2 solid years, and far too reserved a man to ever make much of a case for himself. He used to find reasons to be near her father's house. He rebuilt their front porch steps one summer for almost nothing, just to have himself a reason to be there. My mother had always known, in that soft, unbothered way you know about someone you are not really thinking about, that Ray was there. When the worst of it came down on her, when she was 19 and pregnant and terrified, and the father of her child was 1,000 miles away, not answering letters, it was Ray who came to the house. My mother told me that Ray sat down in her parents' front room with his hat held in his 2 hands and asked her to marry him. And my mother said, "Ray, you know." Just that. "Ray, you know." And my father said, "I know." And that, my mother told me, was the entire conversation. They were married 5 weeks later, and I was born, and the town counted the months on its fingers, the way small towns do, and gossiped for a year, and my father said not one word to anybody, and outlasted it. He outlasted the gossip with his silence. He was extraordinarily good at silence, and I had spent my whole life thinking the silence was aimed at me. I asked my mother the question that was burning the entire front of my mind. I asked her, if he chose it, if he stood in that front room with his hat in his hands and chose me before I was even born, then why? Why was he the way that he was with me? Why the held thing? Why the careful voice and the padded table and the easy laughing love that went straight to Gary and stopped dead at my door? And my mother, who is 88 and does not have the energy left for anything except the truth, told me. She said that my father loved me. She said it the flat, plain way you would state a fact about the weather. And then she said the thing I have been turning over every day since, the thing that took my whole childhood and rebuilt it, board by board, in front of me. She said that every day of my life, my father had been seeing two things at once. His daughter, the girl he had chosen and fed and raised and built furniture for, and, because he was a human being and not a plaster saint, the standing proof of the thing he had decided to carry to his grave and never name. Ray was not careful with me because he loved me less. He was careful because loving me out loud, all the way, meant walking into the middle of a wound he had chosen, and he did not trust himself not to let me see it. So he held still. My mother said, "Diane, your father spent 61 years holding very still, so the ground would never move under your feet, and you grew up thinking the stillness meant he did not want you." I want to tell you that I understood it cleanly, sitting there. I did not. It went into me sideways, and it is honestly still going in. Because do you see the terrible machinery of it? The very thing my father did to protect me, the stillness, the restraint, the careful held love, was the exact thing I spent 40 years reading as rejection. He built me a shelter, and I grew up cold inside it, because no one ever told me it was a shelter. I thought it was a wall. My father and I stood on the same side of the same wall for 61 years, each of us certain we stood there alone. I asked my mother why she had never told me. Not when I was a grown woman with children of my own. Not when my father was dying and there was still time to mend the thing. And she did not defend herself, which somehow made it harder to hear. She said that when I was small, it had been unthinkable, and when I was grown, it had become unthinkable in a new way, and that every year laid another year on top of it until the pile was too heavy for an old woman to lift. She said fear is not loud. Fear is patient. It just waits and lets the years do its work, and then one day you are 88 and you realize the silence has become the longest thing you ever made. But she told me one more thing, and I am handing it to you because it is the very closest I will ever come now to hearing my own father's voice on the matter. My mother said that, more than once across the years, she had gone to Ray and said that they ought to tell me. And every single time, my father said no. And his reason was never shame. My mother was absolutely clear with me on that point. His reason, in the few spare words he ever spent on it, was this. He said, "She has a father. I am not going to be the man who tells her she has to go and wonder." He did not want me to ever, for even 1 hour of my life, feel like a guest inside my own family. He kept the secret in order to keep my belonging whole. And here's the thing I have had to make my peace with, because the nurse in me, the woman who has watched a great many families up close, will not let me make him a hero and walk away clean. My father's choice was a loving one of the most loving things I have ever heard of, and it also carried a cost, and I am the one who paid it, and he could never quite see that he was charging it to me. He kept the secret so I would never feel like a guest, and the secret was part of what made me feel like a guest anyway. He was not a saint, and he was not a villain. He was a good, limited, decent man who did the most loving thing he could think of, and got part of it wrong. The way love, forced to move in the dark, always gets some part of it wrong. I can hold both of those at once now. It took me a long while. I drove home from Pelican Point that evening, and I want to tell you what that drive was like, because the drive itself was when it really happened to me. For an hour and 10 minutes, I went back through the whole of my childhood, one memory at a time, and I watched every cold thing in it turn warm in my hands. The acceptance letter. My father reading it the whole way down, slowly saying, "You will be good at that," and going back out to the shop. I had carried that moment for 40 years as proof of how little the man felt for me. And now I saw something else. A man who had just been handed evidence that the daughter he had chosen, in secret, against the arithmetic of a whole gossiping town, was going to fly. And who had no words safe enough to say so. And who went back out to his shop, where his hands were allowed to say what his mouth never was. Because that was the other thing. My father built me things. I had never let myself count them up before. A bookcase the year I started nursing school. A jewelry box with a tiny brass hinge. And the year I turned 16, a cedar hope chest, dovetailed at every corner, sanded so fine it felt like skin under your palm. I had kept that chest for 45 years and used it to store spare blankets, and never once understood that I had been keeping my father's love letters in a closet and stacking quilts on top of them. He could not say it, so he made it instead, in cedar, with his own hands, and set it on the floor in front of me, and I said, "Thank you, Dad, that is nice," and did not hear a word of what it was. I had to tell Gary. That was its own particular kind of fear, and I want to be honest with you about the shape of that fear, because it was not a noble one. I was afraid that the word half would somehow get down inside my brother and change something. I was afraid that Gary, who had always had the easy version of our father, would now look across at me and see half of a sister. A technicality. Somebody who stood just slightly outside the family that he had grown up so sure of. I drove over to Gary's house, and I sat him down, and I told him all of it. The test, the cluster of strangers, Pelican Point, Russell, the front room, and the hat held in the two hands. And my brother listened to the whole of it, and when I finally stopped talking, he was quiet a moment, and then he said, "Okay." And I said, "What do you mean, okay?" And Gary said, "I mean you are my sister. I have had you for 57 years. A computer does not get a vote." He said half was a word for fractions, not for people, and he was not about to start doing fractions on me at this late stage of his life. And then my brother handed me something I had not known I was starving for. He told me that near the very end, in the last few months, our father had talked to him about me. That Ray had said, more than once, that he was worried about me. That I worked too hard, held myself too far apart from people, did not let myself be loved enough. That he was proud of me and did not think I knew it. My brother had been carrying those sentences around for 3 years, not knowing they were the only food I had left. My father, who gave me 4 thin sentences at his own funeral, had been spending his last real words on me. In the next room, to somebody else. He just, even dying, could not get them across the hall and onto my face. There was still that little cluster of strangers, the surname I had never heard, and after a few weeks had passed, I made myself go and look, because I am a thorough person, and because there was a part of me, a part I am not ashamed of, that genuinely did want to know where the other half of my own face had come from. Russell, my biological father, had died in 2009. I felt, when I read that, almost nothing at all, and I have decided that this is allowed. You cannot grieve a stranger. But Russell had married out in Texas, and he had children, and one of his daughters was there on that same website. A half-sister. Her name is Brenda. She is 58 years old. She lives just outside of Houston, and after I had stared at her name for the better part of a week, I made myself write her a careful and short and probably very strange letter. Brenda wrote me back. "We have spoken on the telephone 4 times now, and we met once, in person, when she came east, and the honest truth is that it is not a fairy tale, and I did not want it to be one. We are 2 women in our 60s who share one dead stranger and one jawline. We are not sisters the way Gary and I are, and we both knew that within 10 minutes of meeting and were kind enough to say so. But Brenda brought me a photograph. Russell, sometime in the 1980s, a man leaning against a truck and squinting into the sun. And I looked at it a long time. I saw my own hands. I saw the line of my own jaw on a man I will never meet and never miss. It answered a small, quiet, lifelong question I had not known was a question, and it answered it without taking anything away from anybody, and that turned out to be exactly enough. Russell is an answer. He was never going to be a father. I already had one of those. People always want to know how it ends. I have learned, telling this, that what they really want is for me to tell them that I got to fix it. And I have to give you the truth instead, because the truth is the only thing in this whole story that is genuinely worth your time. My father is dead. I cannot drive an hour and 10 minutes up the coast and ask him anything. I cannot stand back up at that podium and give him the eulogy that he actually earned, the one about a 24-year-old man with his hat held in his 2 hands, choosing a frightened girl and her unborn child, and then spending 61 years quietly, stubbornly, imperfectly, making good on that choice. That door is shut. It was shut before I ever knew that there was anything on the other side of it worth opening. I have had to accept that the man went to his grave, never knowing that I finally understood him. That is the piece of it that I carry, and I am not going to pretend to you that I have set it down, because I have not, and I do not think that I ever entirely will. But I did do 2 things. They are small things. Small is what is left to you sometimes, and I have come to believe that small is not at all the same thing as nothing. The first is the cedar chest. I took it out of the closet, took the spare blankets out of it, cleaned it, sat with it a while, and then I did something I believe my father would have understood better than any words. I refinished it myself. I learned how. I stripped it down and sanded it the way he would have, with the grain, slow, patient, and oiled it, and it came up warm and alive again under my hands. Inside it now I keep the things that matter, my mother's account of that front room, the printout from the website, Brenda's photograph of a man leaning on a truck, and I had a small brass plate made and fixed to the inside of the lid, and it does not say much because he would not have wanted it to. It says, Ray, my father, because he claimed me in a front room in 1964 before I had done a single thing to earn it. And it took me 61 years, but I have finally claimed him back. The second is my mother. I had to decide what to do with her 61 years of fear and silence. And I will tell you honestly that I did not forgive her instantly, and I do not think instant forgiveness would have been honest or worth much. But my mother is 88. There is not a great deal of time left on the table. And when I really made myself look at it, I found I did not want to spend the time we did have being right. So I forgave her. Not all at once. In the way you actually forgive people, which is a decision you make again on a number of separate ordinary mornings, until one day you notice you have stopped having to make it. I drive up to Pelican Point most weeks now, and we are, strangely, closer than we have ever been, now that there is nothing left in the room that nobody is allowed to mention. I spent 34 years working as a labor and delivery nurse. I told you that at the very start of all this. I have handed more newborn babies to more brand new fathers than I will ever be able to count. And I used to think, watching those men, that I knew exactly what it was that I was looking at. The big, obvious moment. The man, and the infant, and the swelling music of the whole thing. And the entire time, the truest father that I have ever personally known was a quiet carpenter who never once got to have that moment, because the big, obvious version of it was simply never available to him, and who therefore had to go and become a father the other way instead. The slow way. The daily, unwitnessed, unthanked way. The way that looks, from a certain distance, and to an ungenerous eye, and I had a deeply ungenerous eye, like nothing more than a man being just a little bit cold to his daughter across a kitchen table. Here is what I know now, that I did not know for 61 years. There is a kind of love that is loud and easy and shows you all its teeth, and we are trained from childhood to look for that one and to take it as the only proof. And there is another kind entirely, one that has to move quietly because it is carrying something or protecting something, or simply because the person doing the loving was not built with a door wide enough to let the loud kind out. That second kind is not the lesser kind. I had it backward my whole life. Very often, that quiet, careful, held-back love is the one that has bent down and picked up the heaviest thing in the room and is just refusing, year after year, to put it down. Do not do what I did. Do not stand at the fence of your own family and decide all by yourself what the quiet one is feeling. Go and ask. Ask while the asking is still possible to do, because the silence of the people who love us is so very, very rarely the thing that we are so sure it is. If this story landed for you, drop the word claimed in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. The first is this. If there is a quiet person in your family, a careful one, a held one, and you have privately decided what their distance must mean, I want you to understand that you are very probably wrong, that the cost of being wrong is enormous, and that the cure is almost embarrassingly simple. You ask them, out loud, with your actual voice. I built 40 years of hard certainty about my father out of things he never said, and every bit of it was wrong, and he is gone now, and I cannot ask him. And you, whoever you are, very likely still can. And the second, blood will tell you who your relatives are. It is very good at that, and a little plastic tube can do it in under a month. But blood has never once told a single person who their father is. Your father is the one who stood in the front room, the one who stayed and fed you and built you things he could not bring himself to say. If you are lucky enough to still have a person like that, do not wait for a test, or a deathbed, or a locked drawer to make you notice him. Go and claim that person, today, out loud, while they are still in a chair by a window and can hear you do it. Blood makes a relative. Staying makes a father. I'll see you next time.